Chapter 10 of Silas Marner by George Eliot. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Justice Malam was naturally regarded in Tarley and Raveloe as a man of capacious mind, seeing that he could draw much wider conclusions without evidence than could be expected of his neighbours who were not on the commission of the peace. Such a man was not likely to neglect the clue of the tinder-box, and an inquiry was set on foot concerning a pedlar, name unknown, with curly black hair and a foreign complexion, carrying a box of cutlery and jewellery, and wearing large rings in his ears. But either because inquiry was too slow-footed to overtake him, or because the description applied to so many pedlars that inquiry did not know how to choose among them, weeks passed away, and there was no other result concerning the robbery than a gradual cessation of the excitement it had caused in Raveloe. Dunstan Cass's absence was hardly a subject of remark. He had once before had a quarrel with his father, and had gone off, nobody knew whither, to return at the end of 6 weeks, take up his old quarters unforbidden, and swagger as usual. His own family, who equally expected this issue, with the sole difference that the squire was determined this time to forbid him his old quarters, never mentioned his absence, and when his uncle Kimble or Mr. Osgood noticed it, the story of his having killed Wildfire and committed some offence against his father was enough to prevent surprise. To connect the fact of Dunsey's disappearance with that of the robbery occurring on the same day lay quite away from the track of every one's thought, even Godfrey's, who had better reason than any one else to know what his brother was capable of. He remembered no mention of the weaver between them since the time, 12 years ago, when it was their boyish sport to deride him, and besides, his imagination constantly created an alibi for Dunstan. He saw him continually in some congenial haunt, to which he had walked off on leaving Wildfire, saw him sponging on chance acquaintances, and meditating a return home to the old amusement of tormenting his elder brother. Even if any brain in Raveloe had put the said two facts together, I doubt whether a combination so injurious to the prescriptive respectability of a family with a mural monument and venerable tankards would not have been suppressed as of unsound tendency. But Christmas puddings, brawn, and abundance of spirituous liquors, throwing the mental originality into the channel of nightmare, are great preservatives against the dangerous spontaneity of waking thought. When the robbery was talked of at the Rainbow and elsewhere in good company, the balance continued to waver between the rational explanation founded on the tinder-box and the theory of an impenetrable mystery that mocked investigation. The advocates of the tinder-box and pedlar view considered the other side a muddle-headed and credulous set, who, because they themselves were wall-eyed, supposed everybody else to have the same blank outlook, and the adherents of the inexplicable more than hinted that their antagonists were animals inclined to crow before they had found any corn, mere skimming dishes in point of depth, whose clear-sightedness consisted in supposing there was nothing behind a barn door because they couldn't see through it. So that though their controversy did not serve to elicit the fact concerning the robbery, it elicited some true opinions of collateral importance. But while poor Silas's loss served to brush the slow current of Raveloe conversation, Silas himself was feeling the withered desolation of that bereavement about which his neighbours were arguing at their ease. To any one who had observed him before he lost his gold, it might have seemed that so withered and shrunken a life as his could hardly be susceptible of a bruise, could hardly endure any subtraction but such as would put an end to it altogether. But in reality it had been an eager life, filled with immediate purpose, which fenced him in from the wide, cheerless unknown. It had been a clinging life, and though the object round which its fibres had clung was a dead, disrupted thing, it satisfied the need for clinging. But now the fence was broken down, the support was snatched away. Marner's thoughts could no longer move in their old round, and were baffled by a blank like that which meets a plodding ant when the earth has broken away on its homeward path. The loom was there, and the weaving, and the growing pattern in the cloth, but the bright treasure in the hole under his feet was gone, the prospect of handling and counting it was gone. The evening had no phantasm of delight to still the poor soul's craving. The thought of the money he would get by his actual work could bring no joy, for its meagre image was only a fresh reminder of his loss. and hope was too heavily crushed by the sudden blow for his imagination to dwell on the growth of a new hoard from that small beginning. He filled up the blank with grief. As he sat weaving, he every now and then moaned low, like one in pain. It was a sign that his thoughts had come round again to the sudden chasm, to the empty evening time. And all the evening, as he sat in his loneliness by his dull fire, he leaned his elbows on his knees and clasped his head with his hands and moaned very low, not as one who seeks to be heard. And yet he was not utterly forsaken in his trouble. The repulsion Marner had always created in his neighbours was partly dissipated by the new light in which his misfortune had shown him. Instead of a man who had more cunning than honest folk could come by, and, what was worse, had not the inclination to use that cunning in a neighbourly way, it was now apparent that Silas had not cunning enough to keep his own. He was generally spoken of as a poor mushed creature, and that avoidance of his neighbours, which had before been referred to his ill will and to a probable addiction to worse company, was now considered mere craziness. This change to a kindlier feeling was shown in various ways. The odour of Christmas cooking being on the wind, it was the season when superfluous pork and black puddings are suggestive of charity in well-to-do families, and Silas's misfortune had him uppermost in the memory of housekeepers like Mrs. Osgood. Mr. Crackenthorp, too, while he admonished Silas that his money had probably been taken from him because he thought too much of it and never came to church, enforced the doctrine by a present of pig's pettitoes, well calculated to dissipate unfounded prejudices against the clerical character. Neighbours who had nothing but verbal consolation to give showed a disposition not only to greet Silas and discuss his misfortune at some length when they encountered him in the village, but also to take the trouble of calling at his cottage and getting him to repeat all the details on the very spot. And then they would try to cheer him by saying, "Well, Master Marner, you're no worse off nor other poor folks after all, and if you was to be crippled, the parish 'ud give you allowance." I suppose one reason why we are seldom able to comfort our neighbours with our words is, that our goodwill gets adulterated, in spite of ourselves, before it can pass our lips. We can send black puddings and pettitoes without giving them a flavour of our own egoism, but language is a stream that is almost sure to smack of mingled soil. There was a fair proportion of kindness in Raveloe, but it was often of a beery and bungling sort, and took the shape least allied to the complimentary and hypocritical. Mr. Macey, for example, coming one evening expressly to let Silas know that recent events had given him the advantage of standing more favourably in the opinion of a man whose judgment was not formed lightly, opened the conversation by saying, as soon as he had seated himself and adjusted his thumbs, "Come, Master Marner, why, you've no call to sit a-moaning. You're a deal better off to ha' lost your money nor to ha' kept it by foul means. I used to think, when you first came into these parts, as you were no better nor you should be. You were younger a deal than what you are now, but you're allays a staring, white-faced creature, partly like a bald-faced calf, as I may say. But there's no knowing. It isn't every queer-looks thing as old Harry's had the making of. I mean, speaking of toads and such, for they're often harmless like, and useful against varmin. And that's pretty much the same with you, as far as I can see. Though as to the yarbs and stuff that cure the breathing, if you'd brought that sort of knowledge from distant parts, you might have been a bit freer of it. And if the knowledge wasn't well come by, why, you might have made up for it by coming to church regular. For as for the children as the wise woman charmed, I've been at the christening of 'em again and again, and they took the water just as well. And that's reasonable, for if old Harry's a mind to do a bit of kindness for a holiday like, who's got anything against it? That's my thinking. And I've been clerk of this parish 40 year, and I know when the parson and me does the cussing of an Ash Wednesday, there's no cussing of folks as have a mind to be cured without a doctor, let Kimble say what he will. And so, Master Marner, as I was saying, for there's windings and things as may carry you to the fur end of the prayer book afore you get back to 'em, my advice is, as you keep up your spirits. For as for thinking you're a deep un, and have got more inside you nor'll bear daylight, I'm not of that opinion at all. And so I tell the neighbours. For, says I, you talk of Master Marner making out a tale. Why, it's nonsense, that is. It 'ud take a cute man to make a tale like that, and, says I, he looked as scared as a rabbit." During this discursive address, Silas had continued motionless in his previous attitude, leaning his elbows on his knees, and pressing his hands against his head. Mr. Macey, not doubting that he had been listened to, paused in the expectation of some appreciatory reply, but Marner remained silent. He had a sense that the old man meant to be good-natured and neighbourly, but the kindness fell on him as the sunshine falls on the wretched. He had no heart to taste it, and felt that it was very far off him. "Come, Master Marner, have you got nothing to say to that?" said Mr. Macey at last, with a slight accent of impatience. "Oh," said Marner, slowly, shaking his head between his hands, "I thank you kindly." "Aye, to be sure. I thought you would," said Mr. Macey. "And my advice is, have you got a Sunday suit?" "No," said Marner. "I doubted it was so," said Mr. Macey. "Now, let me advise you to get a Sunday suit. There's Tucky, he's a poor creature, but he's got my tailoring business, and some of my money in it, and he shall make a suit at a low price, and give you trust, and then you can come to church and be a bit neighbourly. Why, you've never heard me say amen since you came into these parts, and I recommend you lose no time, for it'll be poor work when Tucky has it all to himself, for I mayn't be equal to standing the desk at all come another winter." Here Mr. Macey paused, perhaps expecting some sign of emotion in his hearer, but not observing any, he went on. "And as for the money for the suit of clothes, why, you get a matter of £1 a week at your weaving, Master Marner, and you're a young man, for all you look so mushed. Why, you couldn't have been 25 when you came into these parts, eh?" Silas started a little at the change to a questioning tone, and answered mildly, "I don't know. I can't rightly say. It's a long while since." After receiving such an answer as this, it is not surprising that Mr. Macey observed, later on in the evening at the Rainbow, that Marner's head was all of a muddle, and that it was to be doubted if he ever knew when Sunday came round, which showed him a worse heathen than many a dog. Another of Silas's comforters, besides Mr. Macey, came to him with a mind highly charged on the same topic. This was Mrs. Winthrop, the wheelwright's wife. The inhabitants of Raveloe were not severely regular in their church-going, and perhaps there was hardly a person in the parish who would not have held that to go to church every Sunday in the calendar would have shown a greedy desire to stand well with heaven, and get an undue advantage over their neighbours, a wish to be better than the common run, that would have implied a reflection on those who had godfathers and godmothers as well as themselves, and had an equal right to the burying service. At the same time, it was understood to be requisite for all those who were not household servants or young men to take the sacrament at one of the great festivals. Squire Cass himself took it on Christmas Day, while those who were held to be good livers went to church with greater, though still with moderate, frequency. Mrs. Winthrop was one of these. She was in all respects a woman of scrupulous conscience, so eager for duties that life seemed to offer them too scantily unless she rose at 4:30, though this threw a scarcity of work over the more advanced hours of the morning, which it was a constant problem with her to remove. Yet she had not the vixenish temper which is sometimes supposed to be a necessary condition of such habits. She was a very mild, patient woman, whose nature it was to seek out all the sadder and more serious elements of life, and pasture her mind upon them. She was the person always first thought of in Raveloe when there was an illness or death in a family, when leeches were to be applied, or there was a sudden disappointment in a monthly nurse. She was a comfortable woman, good-looking, fresh-complexioned, having her lips always slightly screwed, as if she felt herself in a sick-room with the doctor or the clergyman present. But she was never whimpering. No one had ever seen her shed tears. She was simply grave, and inclined to shake her head and sigh, almost imperceptibly, like a funeral mourner who was not a relation. It seems surprising that Ben Winthrop, who loved his quart-pot and his joke, got along so well with Dolly, but she took her husband's jokes and joviality as patiently as everything else, considering that men would be so, and viewing the stronger sex in the light of animals, whom it had pleased heaven to make naturally troublesome, like bulls and turkey-cocks. This good wholesome woman could hardly fail to have her mind drawn strongly towards Silas Marner, now that he appeared in the light of a sufferer; and one Sunday afternoon she took her little boy Aaron with her, and went to call on Silas, carrying in her hand some small lard cakes, flat paste-like articles much esteemed in Raveloe. Aaron, an apple-cheeked youngster of 7, with a clean starched frill which looked like a plate for the apples, needed all his adventurous curiosity to embolden him against the possibility that the big-eyed weaver might do him some bodily injury; and his dubiety was much increased when, on arriving at the stone-pits, they heard the mysterious sound of the loom. "Ah, it's as I thought," said Mrs. Winthrop sadly. They had to knock loudly before Silas heard them, but when he did come to the door he showed no impatience, as he would once have done, at the visit that had been unasked for and unexpected. Formerly his heart had been as a locked casket with its treasure inside, but now the casket was empty, and the lock was broken. Left groping in darkness, with his prop utterly gone, Silas had inevitably a sense, though a dull and half-despairing one, that if any help came to him it must come from without; and there was a slight stirring of expectation at the sight of his fellow-men, a faint consciousness of dependence on their goodwill. He opened the door wide to admit Dolly, but without otherwise returning her greeting than by moving the arm-chair a few inches as a sign that she was to sit down in it. Dolly, as soon as she was seated, removed the white cloth that covered her lard cakes, and said in her gravest way, "I'd a bacon yesterday, Master Marner, and the lard cakes turned out better nor common, and I'd a asked you to accept some if you thought well. I don't eat such things myself, for a bit of bread's what I like from one year's end to the other; but men's stomachs are so comical, they want a change, they do, I know. God help 'em." Dolly sighed gently as she held out the cakes to Silas, who thanked her kindly and looked very close at them absently, being accustomed to look so at everything he took into his hand, eyed all the while by the wondering bright orbs of the small Aaron, who had made an outwork of his mother's chair, and was peeping round from behind it. "There's letters pricked on 'em," said Dolly. "I can't read 'em myself, and there's nobody, not Mr. Macey himself, rightly knows what they mean; but they've a good meaning, for they're the same as is on the pulpit cloth at church. What are they, Aaron, my dear?" Aaron retreated completely behind his outwork. "Oh, go, that's naughty," said his mother mildly. "Well, whatever the letters are, they've a good meaning, and it's a stamp as has been in our house, Ben says, ever since he was a little un, and his mother used to put it on the cakes, and I've allays put it on too, for if there's any good, we've need of it i' this world." "It's I.H.S.," said Silas, at which proof of learning Aaron peeped round the chair again. "Well, to be sure, you can read 'em off," said Dolly. "Ben's read them to me many and many a time, but they slip out o' my mind again. The more's the pity, for they're good letters, else they wouldn't be in the church, and so I prick them on all the loaves and all the cakes, though sometimes they won't hold because of the rising; for, as I said, if there's any good to be got, we've got need of it i' this world, that we have. And I hope they'll bring good to you, Master Marner, for 'tis with that will I brought you the cakes, and you see the letters have held better nor common." Silas was as unable to interpret the letters as Dolly, but there was no possibility of misunderstanding the desire to give comfort that made itself heard in her quiet tones. He said, with more feeling than before, "Thank you kindly." But he laid down the cakes and seated himself absently, drearily unconscious of any distinct benefit towards which the cakes and the letters, or even Dolly's kindness, could tend for him. "Ah, if there's good anywhere, we've need of it," repeated Dolly, who did not lightly forsake a serviceable phrase. She looked at Silas pityingly as she went on. "But you didn't hear the church bells this morning, Master Marner? I doubt you didn't know it was Sunday. Living so alone here, you lose your count, I daresay. And then when your loom makes a noise you can't hear the bells, more particular now the frost kills the sound." "Yes, I did. I heard them," said Silas, to whom Sunday bells were a mere accident of the day, and not part of its sacredness. There had been no bells in Lantern Yard. "Dear heart," said Dolly, pausing before she spoke again, "but what a pity it is you should work of a Sunday, and not clean yourself if you didn't go to church. For if you'd a roasting bit, it might be as you couldn't leave it, being a lone man. But there's the bakers, if you could make up your mind to spend a tuppence on the oven now and then—not every week, of course, I shouldn't like to do that myself. You might carry your bit of dinner there, for it's nothing but right to have a bit of summat hot of a Sunday, and not to make it as you can't know your dinner from Saturday. But now, upon Christmas Day, this blessed Christmas as is ever coming, if you was to take your dinner to the bakers, and go to church, and see the holly and the yew, and hear the anthem, and then take the sacrament, you'd be a deal the better. And you'd know which end you stood on, and you could put your trust in them as knows better nor we do, seeing you'd ha' done what it lies on all of us to do." Dolly's exhortation, which was an unusually long effort of speech for her, was uttered in the soothing persuasive tone with which she would have tried to prevail on a sick man to take his medicine, or a basin of gruel for which he had no appetite. Silas had never before been closely urged on the point of his absence from church, which had only been thought of as a part of his general queerness, and he was too direct and simple to evade Dolly's appeal. "Nay, nay," he said, "I know nothing of church. I've never been to church." "No?" said Dolly, in a low tone of wonderment. Then, bethinking herself of Silas's advent from an unknown country, she said, "Could it ha' been as i'd no church where you was born?" "Oh, yes," said Silas, meditatively, sitting in his usual posture of leaning on his knees and supporting his head. "There was churches, a many. It was a big town. But I knew nothing of 'em. I went to chapel." Dolly was much puzzled at this new word, but she was rather afraid of inquiring further, lest chapel might mean some haunt of wickedness. After a little thought she said, "Well, Master Marner, it's never too late to turn over a new leaf, and if you've never had no church, there's no telling the good it'll do you, for I feel so set up uncomfortable as niver was when I've been and heard the prayers and the singing to the praise and glory o' God as Mr. Macey gives out, and Mr. Crackenthorp saying good words, and more particular on Sacrament Day, and if a bit of trouble comes, I feel as I can put up with it, for I've looked for help i' the right quarter, and gev myself up to them as we must all give ourselves up to at the last, and if we'n done our part, it isn't to be believed as them who are above us 'ull be worse nor we are, and come short o' theirn." Poor Dolly's exposition of her simple Raveloe theology fell rather unmeaningly on Silas's ears, for there was no word in it which could rouse a memory of what he had known as religion, and his comprehension was quite baffled by the plural pronoun, which was no heresy of Dolly's, but only her way of avoiding a presumptuous familiarity. He remained silent, not feeling inclined to assent to the part of Dolly's speech which he fully understood, her recommendation that he should go to church. Indeed, Silas was so unaccustomed to talk beyond the brief questions and answers necessary for the transaction of a simple business, that words did not easily come to him without the urgency of a distinct purpose. But now little Aaron, having become used to the weaver's awful presence, had advanced to his mother's side, and Silas, seeming to notice him for the first time, tried to return Dolly's signs of goodwill by offering the lad a bit of lard cake. Aaron shrank back a little, and rubbed his head against his mother's shoulder, but still thought the piece of cake worth the risk of putting his hand out for it. "Oh, for shame, Aaron," said his mother, taking him on her lap, however. "Why, you don't want cake again yet awhile? He's wonderful hearty," she went on with a little sigh. "That he is, God knows. He's my youngest, and we spoil him sadly, for either me or the father must always have him in our sight, that we must." She stroked Aaron's brown head, and thought it must do Master Marner good to see such a picture of a child. But Marner, on the other side of the hearth, saw the neat-featured rosy face as a mere dim round, with 2 dark spots in it. "And he's got a voice like a bird, you wouldn't think," Dolly went on. "He can sing a Christmas carol as his father taught him, and I take it for a token as he'll come to good, as he can learn the good tune so quick. Come, Aaron, stand up and sing the carol to Master Marner. Come." Aaron replied by rubbing his forehead against his mother's shoulder. "Oh, that's naughty," said Dolly gently. "Stand up when mother tells you, and let me hold the cake till you've done." Aaron was not indisposed to display his talents, even to an ogre, under protecting circumstances; and after a few more signs of coyness, consisting chiefly in rubbing the backs of his hands over his eyes, and then peeping between them at Master Marner to see if he looked anxious for the carol, he at length allowed his head to be duly adjusted, and standing behind the table, which let him appear above it only as far as his broad frill, so that he looked like a cherubic head untroubled with a body, he began with a clear chirp, and in a melody that had the rhythm of an industrious hammer: "God rest you, merry gentlemen, let nothing you dismay, for Jesus Christ our Saviour was born on Christmas Day." Dolly listened with a devout look, glancing at Marner in some confidence that this strain would help to allure him to church. "That's Christmas music," she said when Aaron had ended, and had secured his piece of cake again. "There's no other music equal to the Christmas music. Hark, the Errol Angels sing. And you may judge what it is at church, Master Marner, with the bassoon and the voices, as you can't help thinking you've got to a better place already. For I wouldn't speak ill o' this world, seeing as them that put us in it as knows best, but what with the drink and the quarrelling and the bad illnesses and the hard dying, as I've seen times and times, one's thankful to hear of a better. The boy sings pretty, don't he, Master Marner?" "Yes," said Silas absently, "very pretty." The Christmas carol, with its hammer-like rhythm, had fallen on his ears as strange music, quite unlike a hymn, and could have none of the effect Dolly contemplated. But he wanted to show her that he was grateful, and the only mode that occurred to him was to offer Aaron a bit more cake. "Oh, no, thank you, Master Marner," said Dolly, holding down Aaron's willing hands. "We must be going home now, and so I wish you good-bye, Master Marner. And if you ever feel any ways bad in your inside as you can't fend for yourself, I'll come and clean up for you, and get you a bit of victual and willing. But I beg and pray of you to leave off weaving of a Sunday, for it's bad for your soul and body, and the money as comes in that way 'll be a bad bed to lie down on at the last, if it doesn't fly away nobody knows where, like the white frost. And you'll excuse me for being that free with you, Master Marner, for I wish you well, I do. Make your bow, Aaron." Silas said "Good-bye, and thank you kindly," as he opened the door for Dolly, but he couldn't help feeling relieved when she was gone, relieved that he might weave again and moan at his ease. Her simple view of life and its comforts, by which she had tried to cheer him, was only like a report of unknown objects, which his imagination could not fashion. The fountains of human love and of faith in a divine love had not yet been unlocked, and his soul was still the shrunken rivulet, with only this difference, that its little groove of sand was blocked up, and it wandered confusedly against dark obstruction. And so, notwithstanding the honest persuasions of Mr. Macey and Dolly Winthrop, Silas spent his Christmas day in loneliness, eating his meat in sadness of heart, though the meat had come to him as a neighbourly present. In the morning he looked out on the black frost that seemed to press cruelly on every blade of grass, while the half-icy red pool shivered under the bitter wind. But towards evening the snow began to fall, and curtained him from even that dreary outlook, shutting him close up with his narrow grief. And he sat in his robbed home through the livelong evening, not caring to close his shutters or lock his door, pressing his head between his hands and moaning, till the cold grasped him and told him that his fire was grey. Nobody in this world but himself knew that he was the same Silas Marner who had once loved his fellow with tender love, and trusted in an unseen goodness. Even to himself that past experience had become dim. But in Raveloe village the bells rang merrily, and the church was fuller than all through the rest of the year, with red faces among the abundant dark green boughs, faces prepared for a longer service than usual by an odorous breakfast of toast and ale. Those green boughs, the hymn and anthem never heard but at Christmas, even the Athanasian Creed, which was discriminated from others only as being longer and of exceptional virtue, since it was only read on rare occasions, brought a vague exulting sense, for which the grown men could as little have found words as the children, that something great and mysterious had been done for them in heaven above and in earth below, which they were appropriating by their presence. And then the red faces made their way through the black biting frost to their own homes, feeling themselves free for the rest of the day to eat, drink, and be merry, and using that Christian freedom without diffidence. At Squire Cass's family party that day nobody mentioned Dunstan. Nobody was sorry for his absence, or feared it would be too long. The doctor and his wife, uncle and aunt Kimble, were there, and the annual Christmas talk was carried through without any omissions, rising to the climax of Mr. Kimble's experience when he walked the London hospitals 30 years back, together with striking professional anecdotes then gathered. Whereupon cards followed, when Aunt Kimble's annual failure to follow suit, and Uncle Kimble's irascibility concerning the odd trick which was rarely explicable to him, when it was not on his side, without a general visitation of tricks to see they were formed on sound principles, the whole being accompanied by a strong steaming odour of spirits and water. But the party on Christmas Day, being a strictly family party, was not the pre-eminently brilliant celebration of the season at the Red House. It was the great dance on New Year's Eve that made the glory of Squire Cass's hospitality, as of his forefathers' time out of mind. This was the occasion when all the society of Raveloe and Tarley, whether old acquaintances separated by long rutty distances, or cooled acquaintances separated by misunderstandings concerning runaway calves, or acquaintances founded on intermittent condescension, counted on meeting and comporting themselves with mutual appropriateness. This was the occasion on which fair dames who came on pillions sent their bandboxes before them, supplied with more than their evening costume, for the feast was not to end with a single evening, like a paltry town entertainment, where the whole supply of eatables is put on the table at once, and bedding is scanty. The Red House was provisioned as if for a siege, and as for the spare feather beds ready to be laid on floors, they were as plentiful as might naturally be expected in a family that had killed its own geese for many generations. Godfrey Cass was looking forward to this New Year's Eve with a foolish, reckless longing that made him half deaf to his importunate companion, Anxiety. "Dunsey will be coming home soon. There will be a great blow-up, and how will you bribe his spite to silence?" said Anxiety. "Oh, he won't come home before New Year's Eve, perhaps," said Godfrey, "and I shall sit by Nancy then, and dance with her, and get a kind look from her in spite of herself." "But money is wanted in another quarter," said Anxiety in a louder voice, "and how will you get it without selling your mother's diamond pin? And if you don't get it?" "Well, but something may happen to make things easier. At any rate, there's one pleasure for me close at hand. Nancy is coming." "Yes, and suppose your father should bring matters to a pass that will oblige you to decline marrying her, and to give your reasons—" "Hold your tongue. You don't worry me. I can see Nancy's eyes just as they will look at me, and feel her hand in mine already." But Anxiety went on, though in noisy Christmas company, refusing to be utterly quieted, even by much drinking. End of chapter 10. Chapter 11 of Silas Marner by George Eliot. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Some women, I grant, would not appear to advantage seated on a pillion, and attired in a drab Joseph and a drab beaver bonnet, with a crown resembling a small stewpan; for a garment suggesting a coachman's greatcoat, cut out under an exiguity of cloth that would only allow of miniature capes, is not well adapted to conceal deficiencies of contour, nor is drab a colour that will throw sallow cheeks into lively contrast. It was all the greater triumph to Miss Nancy Lammeter's beauty that she looked thoroughly bewitching in that costume, as, seated on the pillion behind her tall, erect father, she held one arm round him, and looked down, with open-eyed anxiety, at the treacherous snow-covered pools and puddles, which sent up formidable splashings of mud under the stamp of Dobbin's foot. A painter would, perhaps, have preferred her in those moments when she was free from self-consciousness, but certainly the bloom on her cheeks was at its highest point of contrast with the surrounding drab when she arrived at the door of the Red House, and saw Mr. Godfrey Cass ready to lift her from the pillion. She wished her sister Priscilla had come up at the same time behind the servant, for then she would have contrived that Mr. Godfrey should have lifted off Priscilla first, and in the meantime she would have persuaded her father to go round to the horse-block instead of alighting at the doorsteps. It was very painful, when you had made it quite clear to a young man that you were determined not to marry him, however much he might wish it, that he would still continue to pay you marked attentions. Besides, why didn't he always show the same attentions, if he meant them sincerely, instead of being so strange as Mr. Godfrey Cass was, sometimes behaving as if he didn't want to speak to her, and taking no notice of her for weeks and weeks, and then, all on a sudden, almost making love again? Moreover, it was quite plain he had no real love for her, else he would not let people have that to say of him which they did say. Did he suppose that Miss Nancy Lammeter was to be won by any man, squire or no squire, who led a bad life? That was not what she had been used to see in her own father, who was the soberest and best man in that countryside, only a little hot and hasty now and then, if things were not done to the minute. All these thoughts rushed through Nancy's mind in their habitual succession in the moments between her first sight of Mr. Godfrey Cass standing at the door and her own arrival there. Happily the squire came out too, and gave a loud greeting to her father, so that somehow, under cover of this noise, she seemed to find concealment for her confusion and neglect of any suitably formal behaviour, while she was being lifted from the pillion by strong arms which seemed to find her ridiculously small and light. And there was the best reason for hastening into the house at once, since the snow was beginning to fall again, threatening an unpleasant journey for such guests as were still on the road. These were a small minority, for already the afternoon was beginning to decline, and there would not be too much time for the ladies who came from a distance to attire themselves in readiness for the early tea which was to inspirit them for the dance. There was a buzz of voices through the house as Miss Nancy entered, mingled with the scrape of a fiddle preluding in the kitchen. But the Lammeters were guests whose arrival had evidently been thought of so much that it had been watched for from the windows. For Mrs. Kimble, who did the honours of the Red House on these great occasions, came forward to meet Miss Nancy in the hall, and conduct her upstairs. Mrs. Kimble was the squire's sister, as well as the doctor's wife, a double dignity with which her diameter was in direct proportion, so that, a journey upstairs being rather fatiguing to her, she did not oppose Miss Nancy's request to be allowed to find her way alone to the Blue Room, where the Miss Lammeters' bandboxes had been deposited on their arrival in the morning. There was hardly a bedroom in the house where feminine compliments were not passing, and feminine toilettes going forward, in various stages, in space made scanty by extra beds spread upon the floor; and Miss Nancy, as she entered the Blue Room, had to make her little formal curtsy to a group of 6. On the one hand there were ladies no less important than the 2 Miss Gunns, the wine merchant's daughters from Litherley, dressed in the height of fashion, with the tightest skirts and the shortest waists, and gazed at by Miss Ladbrook, of the old pastures, with a shyness not unsustained by inward criticism. Partly Miss Ladbrook felt that her own skirt must be regarded as unduly lax by the Miss Gunns, and partly that it was a pity the Miss Gunns did not show that judgment which she herself would show if she were in their place, by stopping a little on this side of the fashion. On the other hand, Mrs. Ladbrook was standing in skull-cap and front, with her turban in her hand, curtsying and smiling blandly, and saying, "After you, ma'am," to another lady in similar circumstances, who had politely offered the precedence at the looking-glass. But Miss Nancy had no sooner made her curtsy than an elderly lady came forward, whose full white muslin kerchief and mob-cap round her curls of smooth grey hair were in daring contrast with the puffed yellow satins and top-knotted caps of her neighbours. She approached Miss Nancy with much primness, and said with a slow treble suavity, "Niece, I hope I see you well in health." Miss Nancy kissed her aunt's cheeks dutifully, and answered with the same sort of amiable primness, "Quite well, I thank you, aunt, and I hope I see you the same." "Thank you, niece. I keep my health for the present. And how is my brother-in-law?" These dutiful questions and answers were continued until it was ascertained in detail that the Lammeters were all as well as usual, and the Osgoods likewise; also that niece Priscilla must certainly arrive shortly, and that travelling on pillions in snowy weather was unpleasant, though a Joseph was a great protection. Then Nancy was formally introduced to her aunt's visitors, the Miss Gunns, as being the daughters of a mother known to their mother, though now, for the first time, induced to make a journey into these parts. And these ladies were so taken by surprise at finding such a lovely face and figure in an out-of-the-way country place, that they began to feel some curiosity about the dress she would put on when she took off her Joseph. Miss Nancy, whose thoughts were always conducted with a propriety and moderation conspicuous in her manners, remarked to herself that the Miss Gunns were rather hard-featured than otherwise, and that such very low dresses as they wore might have been attributed to their vanity if their shoulders had been pretty, but that, being as they were, it was not reasonable to suppose that they showed their necks from a love of display, but rather from some obligation not inconsistent with sense and modesty. She felt convinced, as she opened her box, that this must be her aunt Osgood's opinion, for Miss Nancy's mind resembled her aunt's to a degree that everybody said was surprising, considering the kinship was on Mr. Osgood's side, and though you might not have supposed it from the formality of their greeting, there was a devoted attachment and mutual admiration between aunt and niece. Even Miss Nancy's refusal of her cousin Gilbert Osgood, on the ground solely that he was her cousin, though it had grieved her aunt greatly, had not in the least cooled the preference which had determined her to leave Nancy several of her hereditary ornaments, let Gilbert's future wife be whom she might. Three of the ladies quickly retired, but the Miss Gunns were quite content that Mrs. Osgood's inclination to remain with her niece gave them also a reason for staying to see the rustic beauty's toilette. And it really was a pleasure, from the first opening of the bandbox, where everything smelt of lavender and rose-leaves, to the clasping of the small coral necklace that fitted closely round her little white neck. Everything belonging to Miss Nancy was of delicate purity and nattiness. Not a crease was where it had no business to be. Not a bit of her linen professed whiteness without fulfilling its profession. The very pins on her pincushion were stuck in after a pattern from which she was careful to allow no aberration; and as for her own person, it gave the same idea of perfect unvarying neatness as the body of a little bird. It is true that her light brown hair was cropped behind like a boy's, and was dressed in front in a number of flat rings that lay quite away from her face, but there was no sort of coiffure that could make Miss Nancy's cheek and neck look otherwise than pretty. And when at last she stood complete in her silvery twilled silk, her lace tucker, her coral necklace, and her coral eardrops, the Miss Gunns could see nothing to criticise except her hands, which bore the traces of butter-making, cheese-crushing, and even still coarser work. But Miss Nancy was not ashamed of that, for even while she was dressing she narrated to her aunt how she and Priscilla had packed their boxes yesterday, because this morning was baking morning, and since they were leaving home, it was desirable to make a good supply of meat pies for the kitchen; and as she concluded this judicious remark, she turned to the Miss Gunns that she might not commit the rudeness of not including them in the conversation. The Miss Gunns smiled stiffly, and thought what a pity it was that these rich country people, who could afford to buy such good clothes—really Miss Nancy's lace and silk were very costly—should be brought up in utter ignorance and vulgarity. She actually said mate for meat, appen for perhaps, and os for horse, which to young ladies living in good Litherly society, who habitually said orse even in domestic privacy, and only said appen on the right occasions, was necessarily shocking. Miss Nancy, indeed, had never been to any school higher than Dame Tedman's. Her acquaintance with profane literature hardly went beyond the rhymes she had worked in her large sampler under the Lamb and the Shepherdess, and in order to balance an account she was obliged to effect her subtraction by removing visible metallic shillings and sixpences from a visible metallic total. There is hardly a servant-maid in these days who is not better informed than Miss Nancy. Yet she had the essential attributes of a lady: high veracity, delicate honour in her dealings, deference to others, and refined personal habits. And lest these should not suffice to convince grammatical fair ones that her feelings cannot all resemble theirs, I will add that she was slightly proud and exacting, and as constant in her affection towards a baseless opinion as towards an erring lover. The anxiety about sister Priscilla, which had grown rather active by the time the coral necklace was clasped, was happily ended by the entrance of that cheerful-looking lady herself, with a face made blowsy by cold and damp. After the first questions and greetings, she turned to Nancy and surveyed her from head to foot, then wheeled her round to ascertain that the back view was equally faultless. "What do you think of these gowns, Aunt Osgood?" said Priscilla, while Nancy helped her to unrobe. "Very handsome indeed, niece," said Mrs. Osgood, with a slight increase of formality. She always thought niece Priscilla too rough. "I'm obliged to have the same as Nancy, you know, for all I'm 5 years older, and it makes me look yellow. For she never will have anything without I have mine just like it, because she wants us to look like sisters. And I tell her, folks'll think it's my weakness makes me fancy I shall look pretty in what she looks pretty in. For I am ugly, there's no denying that. I feature my father's family. But law, I don't mind. Do you?" Priscilla here turned to the Miss Gunns, rattling on in too much preoccupation with the delight of talking to notice that her candour was not appreciated. "The pretty ones do for fly-catchers. They keep the men off us. I've no opinion of the men, Miss Gunn. I don't know what you have. And as for fretting and stewing about what they'll think of you from morning till night, and making your life uneasy about what they're doing when they're out of sight, as I tell Nancy, it's a folly no woman need be guilty of, if she's got a good father and a good home. Let her leave it to them as have got no fortune and can't help themselves. As I say, Mr. Have-your-own-way is the best husband, and the only one I'd ever promise to obey. I know it isn't pleasant, when you've been used to living in a big way and managing hogsheads and all that, to go and put your nose in by somebody else's fireside, or sit down by yourself to a scrag or a knuckle, but thank God my father's a sober man and likely to live. And if you've got a man by the chimney-corner, it doesn't matter if he's childish. The business needn't be broke up." The delicate process of getting her narrow gown over her head without injury to her smooth curls obliged Miss Priscilla to pause in this rapid survey of life, and Mrs. Osgood seized the opportunity of rising and saying, "Well, niece, you'll follow us? The Miss Gunns will like to go down?" "Sister," said Nancy, when they were alone, "you've offended the Miss Gunns, I'm sure." "What have I done, child?" said Priscilla, in some alarm. "Why, you asked them if they minded about being ugly. You're so very blunt." "Law, did I? Well, it popped out. It's a mercy I said no more, for I'm a bad un to live with folks if they don't like the truth. But as for being ugly, look at me, child, in this silver-coloured silk. I told you how it'd be. I look as yellow as a daffodil. Anybody'd say you wanted to make a mawkin of me." "No, Prissy, don't say so. I prayed and begged of you not to let us have this silk if you liked another better. I was willing to have your choice, you know I was," said Nancy, in anxious self-vindication. "Nonsense, child. You know you'd set your heart on this, and reason good, for you're the colour of cream. It'd be fine doings for you to dress yourself to suit my skin. What I find fault with is that notion of yours that I must dress just like you. But you do as you like with me, you always did, from when first you begun to walk. If you wanted to go the field's length you'd go, and there was no whipping you, for you looked as prim and innocent as a daisy all the while." "Prissy," said Nancy gently, as she fastened a coral necklace, exactly like her own, round Priscilla's neck, which was very far from being like her own, "I'm sure I'm willing to give way as far as is right, but who shouldn't dress alike if it isn't sisters? Would you have us go about looking as if we were no kin to one another, us that have got no mother, and not another sister in the world? I'd do what was right if I dressed in a gown dyed with cheese-colouring, and I'd rather you'd choose and let me wear what pleases you." "There you go again. You'd come round to the same thing if one talked to you from Saturday night till Saturday morning. It'll be fine fun to see how you'll master your husband, and never raise your voice above the singing of the kettle all the while. I like to see the men mastered." "Don't talk so, Prissy," said Nancy, blushing. "You know I don't mean ever to be married." "Oh, you never mean a fiddlestick's end," said Priscilla, as she arranged her discarded dress and closed her bandbox. "Who shall I have to work for when father's gone, if you are to go and take notions into your head and be an old maid, because some folks are no better than they should be? I haven't a bit o' patience with you sitting over an addled egg for ever, as if there was never a freshen in the world. One old maid's enough out of two sisters, and I shall do credit to a single life, for God Almighty meant me for it. Come, we can go down now. I'm as ready as a mawkin can be. There's nothing a-wanting to frighten the crows, now I've got my eardroppers in." As the two Miss Lammeters walked into the large parlour together, any one who did not know the character of both might certainly have supposed that the reason why the square-shouldered, clumsy, high-featured Priscilla wore a dress the facsimile of her pretty sister's was either the mistaken vanity of the one, or the malicious contrivance of the other in order to set off her own rare beauty. But the good-natured, self-forgetful cheerfulness and common sense of Priscilla would soon have dissipated the one suspicion, and the modest calm of Nancy's speech and manners told clearly of a mind free from all disavowed devices. Places of honour had been kept for the Miss Lammeters near the head of the principal tea-table in the wainscoted parlour, now looking fresh and pleasant with handsome branches of holly, yew, and laurel from the abundant growth of the old garden, and Nancy felt an inward flutter that no firmness of purpose could prevent when she saw Mr. Godfrey Cass advancing to lead her to a seat between himself and Mr. Crackenthorp, while Priscilla was called to the opposite side between her father and the squire. It certainly did make some difference to Nancy that the lover she had given up was the young man of quite the highest consequence in the parish, at home in a venerable and unique parlour, which was the extremity of grandeur in her experience, a parlour where she might one day have been mistress, with the consciousness that she was spoken of as Madam Cass, the squire's wife. These circumstances exalted her inward drama in her own eyes, and deepened the emphasis with which she declared to herself that not the most dazzling rank should induce her to marry a man whose conduct showed him careless of his character, but that love once, love always, was the motto of a true and pure woman, and no man should ever have any right over her which would be a call on her to destroy the dried flowers that she treasured, and always would treasure, for Godfrey Cass's sake. And Nancy was capable of keeping her word to herself under very trying conditions. Nothing but a becoming blush betrayed the moving thoughts that urged themselves upon her as she accepted the seat next to Mr. Crackenthorp, for she was so instinctively neat and adroit in all her actions, and her pretty lips met each other with such quiet firmness, that it would have been difficult for her to appear agitated. It was not the rector's practice to let a charming blush pass without an appropriate compliment. He was not in the least lofty or aristocratic, but simply a merry-eyed, small-featured, grey-haired man, with his chin propped by an ample, many-creased white neckcloth, which seemed to predominate over every other point in his person, and somehow to impress its peculiar character on his remarks, so that to have considered his amenities apart from his cravat would have been a severe and perhaps dangerous effort of abstraction. "Ah, Miss Nancy," he said, turning his head within his cravat and smiling down pleasantly upon her, "when anybody pretends this has been a severe winter, I shall tell them I saw the roses blooming on New Year's Eve. Eh, Godfrey, what do you say?" Godfrey made no reply, and avoided looking at Nancy very markedly, for though these complimentary personalities were held to be in excellent taste in old-fashioned Raveloe society, reverent love has a politeness of its own which it teaches to men otherwise of small schooling. But the squire was rather impatient at Godfrey showing himself a dull spark in this way. By this advanced hour of the day the squire was always in higher spirits than we have seen him in at the breakfast-table, and felt it quite pleasant to fulfil the hereditary duty of being noisily jovial and patronizing. The large silver snuff-box was in active service, and was offered without fail to all neighbours from time to time, however often they might have declined the favour. At present the squire had only given an express welcome to the heads of families as they appeared, but always as the evening deepened his hospitality rayed out more widely, till he had tapped the youngest guests on the back and shown a peculiar fondness for their presence, in the full belief that they must feel their lives made happy by their belonging to a parish where there was such a hearty man as Squire Cass to invite them and wish them well. Even in this early stage of the jovial mood, it was natural that he should wish to supply his son's deficiencies by looking and speaking for him. "Aye, aye, He began offering his snuff-box to Mr. Lammeter, who, for the second time, bowed his head and waved his hand in stiff rejection of the offer. "Us old fellows may wish ourselves young to-night, when we see the mistletoe bough in the white parlour. It's true most things are going backward in these last 30 years. The country's going down since the old king fell ill. But when I look at Miss Nancy here, I begin to think the lasses keep up their quality. Ding me if I remember a sample to match her. Not when I was a fine young fellow and thought a deal about my pigtail. Oh, no offence to you, madam," he added, bending to Mrs. Crackenthorp, who sat by him. "I didn't know you when you was as young as Miss Nancy here." Mrs. Crackenthorp, a small blinking woman, who fidgeted incessantly with her lace, ribbons, and gold chain, turning her head about and making subdued noises, very much like a guinea pig that twitches its nose and soliloquizes in all company indiscriminately, now blinked and fidgeted towards the squire, and said, "Oh, no, no offence." This emphatic compliment of the squire's to Nancy was felt by others besides Godfrey to have a diplomatic significance, and her father gave a slight additional erectness to his back as he looked across the table at her with complacent gravity. That grave and orderly senior was not going to bate a jot of his dignity by seeming elated at the notion of a match between his family and the squire's. He was gratified by any honour paid to his daughter, but he must see an alteration in several ways before his consent would be vouchsafed. His spare but healthy person, and high-featured firm face that looked as if it had never been flushed by excess, was in strong contrast, not only with the squire's, but with the appearance of the Raveloe farmers generally, in accordance with a favourite saying of his own, that breed was stronger than pasture. "Miss Nancy's wonderful like what her mother was, though, isn't she, Kimble?" said the stout lady of that name, looking round for her husband. But Dr. Kimble, country apothecaries in old days enjoyed that title without authority of diploma, being a thin and agile man, was flitting about the room with his hands in his pockets, making himself agreeable to his feminine patients with medical impartiality, and being welcomed everywhere as a doctor by hereditary right. Not one of these miserable apothecaries who canvass for practice in strange neighbourhoods, and spend all their income in starving their one horse, but a man of substance, able to keep an extravagant table like the best of his patients. Time out of mind, the Raveloe doctor had been a Kimble. Kimble was inherently a doctor's name, and it was difficult to contemplate firmly the melancholy fact that the actual Kimble had no son, so that his practice might one day be handed over to a successor with the incongruous name of Taylor or Johnson. But in that case the wiser people in Raveloe would employ Dr. Blick of Flitton as less unnatural. "Did you speak to me, my dear?" said the authentic doctor, coming quickly to his wife's side; but, as if foreseeing that she would be too much out of breath to repeat her remark, he went on immediately. "Ah, Miss Priscilla, the sight of you revives the taste of that super-excellent pork pie. I hope the batch isn't near an end." "Yes, indeed it is, doctor," said Priscilla, "but I'll answer for it the next shall be as good. My pork pies don't turn out well by chance." "Not as your doctoring does, eh, Kimble? Because folks forget to take your physic, eh?" said the squire, who regarded physic and doctors as many loyal churchmen regarded the church and the clergy, tasting a joke against them when he was in health, but impatiently eager for their aid when anything was the matter with him. He tapped his box and looked round with a triumphant laugh. "Ah, she has a quick wit, my friend Priscilla has," said the doctor, choosing to attribute the epigram to a lady, rather than allow a brother-in-law that advantage over him. "She saves a little pepper to sprinkle over her talk. That's the reason why she never puts too much into her pies. There's my wife, now. She never has an answer at her tongue's end, but if I offend her, she's sure to scarify my throat with black pepper the next day, or else give me the colic with watery greens. Oh, that's an awful tit for tat." Here the vivacious doctor made a pathetic grimace. "Did you ever hear the like?" said Mrs. Kimble, laughing above her double chin with much good humour, aside to Mrs. Crackenthorp, who blinked and nodded, and seemed to intend a smile, which, by the correlation of forces, went off in small twitchings and noises. "I suppose that's the sort of tit-for-tat adopted in your profession, Kimble, if you've a grudge against a patient," said the rector. "Never do have a grudge against our patients," said Mr. Kimble, "except when they leave us. And then, you see, we haven't the chance of prescribing for him. Ah, Miss Nancy," he continued, suddenly skipping to Nancy's side, "you won't forget your promise? You're to save a dance for me, you know." "Come, come, Kimble, don't you be too forward," said the Squire. "Give the young uns fair play. There's my son Godfrey'll be wanted to have a round with you if you run off with Miss Nancy. He's bespoke her for the first dance, I'll be bound. Eh, sir? What do you say?" he continued, throwing himself backward and looking at Godfrey. "Haven't you asked Miss Nancy to open the dance with you?" Godfrey, sorely uncomfortable under this significant insistence about Nancy, and afraid to think where it would end by the time his father had set his usual hospitable example of drinking before and after supper, saw no course open but to turn to Nancy and say, with as little awkwardness as possible— "No, I've not asked her yet, but I hope she'll consent, if somebody else hasn't been before me." "No, I've not engaged myself," said Nancy quietly, though blushingly. If Mr. Godfrey founded any hopes on her consenting to dance with him, he would soon be undeceived, but there was no need for her to be uncivil. "Then I hope you'll have no objections to dance with me," said Godfrey, beginning to lose the sense that there was anything uncomfortable in this arrangement. "No, no objections," said Nancy in a cold tone. "Ah, well, you are a lucky fellow, Godfrey," said Uncle Kimble. "But you're my godson, so I won't stand in your way. Else I'm not so very old, eh, my dear?" he went on, skipping to his wife's side again. "You wouldn't mind my having a second after you are gone, not if I cried a good deal first." "Come, come, take a cup of tea and stop your tongue, do," said good-humoured Mrs. Kimble, feeling some pride in a husband who must be regarded as so clever and amusing by the company generally, if he had only not been irritable at cards. While safe, well-tested personalities were enlivening the tea in this way, the sound of the fiddle approaching within a distance at which it could be heard distinctly made the young people look at each other with sympathetic impatience for the end of the meal. "Why, there's Solomon in the hall," said the Squire, "and playing my favourite tune. I believe the flaxen-headed ploughboy. He's for giving us a hint as we aren't in enough of a hurry to hear him play. Bob," he called out to his third long-legged son, who was at the other end of the room, "open the door and tell Solomon to come in. He shall give us a tune here." Bob obeyed, and Solomon walked in, fiddling as he walked, for he would on no account break off in the middle of a tune. "Here, Solomon," said the Squire, with loud patronage. "Round here, my man. Ah, I knew it was a flaxen-headed ploughboy. There's no finer tune." Solomon Macey, a small, hale old man with an abundant crop of long white hair, reaching nearly to his shoulders, advanced to the indicated spot, bowing reverently while he fiddled, as much as to say that he respected the company, though he respected the keynote more. As soon as he had repeated the tune and lowered his fiddle, he bowed again to the Squire and the rector, and said, "I hope I see your honour and your reverence well, and wishing you health and long life and happy New Year. And wishing the same to you, Mr. Lammeter, sir, and to the other gentlemen and madams, and the young lasses." As Solomon uttered these last words, he bowed in all directions solicitously, lest he should be wanting in due respect. But thereupon he immediately began to prelude, and fell into the tune which he knew would be taken as a special compliment by Mr. Lammeter. "Thank ye, Solomon, thank ye," said Mr. Lammeter, when the fiddle paused again. "That's over the hills and far away, that is. My father used to say to me, whenever we heard that tune, 'Ah, lad, I came from over the hills and far away.' There's a many tunes I don't make head or tail of, but that speaks to me like a blackbird's whistle. I suppose it's the name. There's a deal in the name of a tune." But Solomon was already impatient to prelude again, and presently broke with much spirit into Sir Roger de Coverley, at which there was a sound of chairs pushed back and laughing voices. "Aye, aye, Solomon, we know what that means," said the Squire, rising. "It's time to begin the dance, eh? Lead the way, then, and we'll all follow you." So Solomon, holding his white head on one side, and playing vigorously, marched forward at the head of the gay procession into the white parlour, where the mistletoe bough was hung, and multitudinous tallow candles made rather a brilliant effect, gleaming from among the buried holly boughs, and reflected in the old-fashioned oval mirrors fastened in the panels of the white wainscot. A quaint procession. Old Solomon, in his seedy clothes and long white locks, seemed to be luring that decent company by the magic screams of his fiddle. Luring discreet matrons in turban-shaped caps, nay, Mrs. Crackenthorp herself, the summit of whose perpendicular feather was on a level with the squire's shoulder; luring fair lasses complacently conscious of very short waists and skirts blameless of front folds; luring burly fathers in large variegated waistcoats, and ruddy sons, for the most part shy and sheepish, in short nether garments and very long coat-tails. Already Mr. Macey and a few other privileged villagers, who were allowed to be spectators on these great occasions, were seated on benches placed for them near the door; and great was the admiration and satisfaction in that quarter when the couples had formed themselves for the dance, and the squire led off with Mrs. Crackenthorp, joining hands with the rector and Mrs. Osgood. That was as it should be. That was what everybody had been used to, and the character of Raveloe seemed to be renewed by the ceremony. It was not thought of as an unbecoming levity for the old and middle-aged people to dance a little before sitting down to cards, but rather as part of their social duties. For what were these if not to be merry at appropriate times, interchanging visits and poultry with due frequency, paying each other old established compliments in sound traditional phrases, passing well-tried personal jokes, urging your guests to eat and drink too much out of hospitality, and eating and drinking too much in your neighbour's house to show that you liked your cheer. And the parson naturally set an example in these social duties, for it would not have been possible for the Raveloe mind, without a peculiar revelation, to know that a clergyman should be a pale-faced memento of solemnities, instead of a reasonably faulty man whose exclusive authority to read prayers and preach, to christen, marry, and bury you, necessarily coexisted with the right to sell you the ground to be buried in, and to take tithe in kind, on which last point, of course, there was a little grumbling, but not to the extent of irreligion, not of deeper significance than the grumbling at the rain, which was by no means accompanied with a spirit of impious defiance, but with a desire that the prayer for finer weather might be read forthwith. There was no reason, then, why the rector's dancing should not be received as part of the fitness of things, quite as much as the squire's, or why, on the other hand, Mr. Macey's official respect should restrain him from subjecting the parson's performance to that criticism with which minds of extraordinary acuteness must necessarily contemplate the doings of their fallible fellow-men. "The squire's pretty springe, considering his weight," said Mr. Macey, "and he steps uncommon well. But Mr. Lammeter beats 'em all for shapes. You see, he holds his head like a sojer, and he isn't so cushiony as most of the oldish gentlefolk. They run to fat in general, and he's got a fine leg. The parson's nimble enough, but he hasn't got much of a leg. It's a bit too thick down'ard, and his knees might be a bit nearer without damage. But he might do worse, he might do worse. Though he hasn't that grand way of waving his hand as the squire has." "Talking nimbleness, look at Mrs. Osgood," said Ben Winthrop, who was holding his son Aaron between his knees. "She trips along with her little steps so as nobody can see how she goes. It's like as if she had little wheels to her feet. She doesn't look a day older nor last year. She's the finest made woman as is, let the next be where she will." "I don't heed how the women are made," said Mr. Macey with some contempt. "They wear neither coats nor breeches. You can't make much out of their shapes." "Feyther," said Aaron, whose feet were busy beating out the tune, "how does that big cock's feather stick in Mrs. Crackenthorp's yet? Is there a little hole for it, like in my shuttlecock?" "Hush, lad, hush! That's the way the ladies dress theirselves, that is," said the father, adding, however, in an undertone to Mr. Macey, "It does make her look funny, though, partly like a short-necked bottle, with a long quill in it. By jingo, there's the young squire leading off now with Miss Nancy for partners. There's a lass for you, like a pink and white posy. There's nobody 'ud think as anybody could be so pretty. I shouldn't wonder if she's Madam Cass some day, after all, and nobody more rightfuller, for they'd make a fine match." "You can't find nothing against Master Godfrey's shapes, Macey, I'll bet a penny." Mr. Macey screwed up his mouth, leaned his head further on one side, and twirled his thumbs with a presto movement, as his eyes followed Godfrey up the dance. At last he summed up his opinion. Pretty well down'ard, but a bit too round at the shoulder blades. And as for them coats as he gets from the flitting tailor, they're a poor cut to pay double money for. Ah, Mr. Macey, you and me are two folks," said Ben, slightly indignant at this carping. "When I got a pot o' good ale, I like to swaller it and do my inside good, instead o' smelling and staring at it to see if I can't find fault with the brewing. I should like you to pick out a finer limbed young fellow nor Master Godfrey, one as 'ud knock you down easier, or is more pleasanter looks when he's pert and merry." "Tchuh," said Mr. Macey, provoked to increased severity, "he isn't come to his right colour yet. He's partly like a slack-baked pie. And I doubt he's got a soft place in his head, else why should he be turned round the finger by that awful Dunsey as nobody's seen o' late, and let him kill that fine hunting horse as was the talk o' the country, and one while he's always after Miss Nancy, and then it all went off again, like the smell o' hot porridge, as I may say? That wasn't my way when I went a courting." "Ah, but perhaps Miss Nancy hung off like, and your lass didn't," said Ben. "I should say she didn't," said Mr. Macey significantly. "Before I said sniff, I took care to know as she'd say snaff, and pretty quick too. I wasn't a going to open my mouth like a dog at a fly, and snap it to again with nothing to swaller." "Well, I think Miss Nancy's a coming round again," said Ben, "for Master Godfrey doesn't look so downhearted to-night. And I see he's for taking her away to sit down, now they're at the end of the dance. That looks like sweethearting, that does." The reason why Godfrey and Nancy had left the dance was not so tender as Ben imagined. In the close press of couples, a slight accident had happened to Nancy's dress, which, while it was short enough to show her neat ankle in front, was long enough behind to be caught under the stately stamp of the squire's foot, so as to rend certain stitches at the waist and cause much sisterly agitation in Priscilla's mind, as well as serious concern in Nancy's. One's thoughts may be much occupied with love struggles, but hardly so as to be insensible to a disorder in the general framework of things. Nancy had no sooner completed her duty in the figure they were dancing than she said to Godfrey, with a deep blush, that she must go and sit down till Priscilla could come to her, for the sisters had already exchanged a short whisper and an open-eyed glance full of meaning. No reason less urgent than this could have prevailed on Nancy to give Godfrey this opportunity of sitting apart with her. As for Godfrey, he was feeling so happy and oblivious under the long charm of the country dance with Nancy, that he got rather bold on the strength of her confusion, and was capable of leading her straight away, without leave asked, into the adjoining small parlour, where the card-tables were set. "Oh, no, thank you," said Nancy coldly, as soon as she perceived where he was going. "Not in there. I'll wait here till Priscilla's ready to come to me. I'm sorry to bring you out of the dance and make myself troublesome." "Why, you'll be more comfortable here by yourself," said the artful Godfrey. "I'll leave you here till your sister can come." He spoke in an indifferent tone. That was an agreeable proposition, and just what Nancy desired. Why then was she a little hurt that Mr. Godfrey should make it? They entered, and she seated herself on a chair against one of the card-tables, as the stiffest and most unapproachable position she could choose. "Thank you, sir," she said immediately. "I needn't give you any more trouble. I'm sorry you've had such an unlucky partner." "That's very ill-natured of you," said Godfrey, standing by her without any sign of intended departure. "To be sorry you've danced with me." "Oh, no, sir, I don't mean to say what's ill-natured at all," said Nancy, looking distractingly prim and pretty. "When gentlemen have so many pleasures, one dance can matter but very little." "You know that isn't true. You know one dance with you matters more to me than all the other pleasures in the world." It was a long, long while since Godfrey had said anything so direct as that, and Nancy was startled. But her instinctive dignity and repugnance to any show of emotion made her sit perfectly still, and only throw a little more decision into her voice as she said, "No, indeed, Mr. Godfrey, that's not known to me, and I have very good reason for thinking different. But if it's true, I don't wish to hear it." "Would you never forgive me then, Nancy? Never think well of me, let what would happen? Would you never think the present made amends for the past? Not if I turned a good fellow, and gave up everything you don't like?" Godfrey was half conscious that this sudden opportunity of speaking to Nancy alone had driven him beside himself, but blind feeling had got the mastery of his tongue. Nancy felt much agitated by the possibility Godfrey's words suggested, but this very pressure of emotion that she was in danger of finding too strong for her roused all her power of self-command. "I should be glad to see a good change in anybody, Mr. Godfrey," she answered, with the slightest discernible difference of tone. "But it'd be better if no change was wanted." "You're very hard-hearted, Nancy," said Godfrey pettishly. "You might encourage me to be a better fellow. I'm very miserable, but you've no feeling." "I think those have the least feeling that act wrong to begin with," said Nancy, sending out a flash in spite of herself. Godfrey was delighted with that little flash, and would have liked to go on and make her quarrel with them. Nancy was so exasperatingly quiet and firm, but she was not indifferent to him yet, though. The entrance of Priscilla, bustling forward and saying, "Dear heart alive, child, let us look at this gown," cut off Godfrey's hopes of a quarrel. "I suppose I must go now," he said to Priscilla. "It's no matter to me whether you go or stay," said that frank lady, searching for something in her pocket with a preoccupied brow. "Do you want me to go?" said Godfrey, looking at Nancy, who was now standing up by Priscilla's order. "As you like," said Nancy, trying to recover all her former coldness, and looking down carefully at the hem of her gown. "Then I like to stay," said Godfrey, with a reckless determination to get as much of this joy as he could to-night, and think nothing of the morrow. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of Silas Marner by George Eliot. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. While Godfrey Cass was taking draughts of forgetfulness from the sweet presence of Nancy, willingly losing all sense of that hidden bond which at other moments galled and fretted him so as to mingle irritation with the very sunshine, Godfrey's wife was walking with slow uncertain steps through the snow-covered Raveloe lanes, carrying her child in her arms. This journey on New Year's Eve was a premeditated act of vengeance which she had kept in her heart ever since Godfrey, in a fit of passion, had told her he would sooner die than acknowledge her as his wife. There would be a great party at the Red House on New Year's Eve, she knew. Her husband would be smiling and smiled upon, hiding her existence in the darkest corner of his heart. But she would mar his pleasure. She would go in her dingy rags, with her faded face once as handsome as the best, with her little child that had its father's hair and eyes, and disclose herself to the squire as his eldest son's wife. It is seldom that the miserable can help regarding their misery as a wrong inflicted by those who are less miserable. Molly knew that the cause of her dingy rags was not her husband's neglect, but the demon opium to whom she was enslaved, body and soul, except in the lingering mother's tenderness that refused to give him her hungry child. She knew this well, and yet in the moments of wretched unbenumbed consciousness the sense of her want and degradation transformed itself continually into bitterness towards Godfrey. He was well off, and if she had her rights she would be well off too. The belief that he repented his marriage and suffered from it only aggravated her vindictiveness. Just and self-reproving thoughts do not come to us too thickly, even in the purest air, and with the best lessons of heaven and earth. How should those white-winged delicate messengers make their way to Molly's poisoned chamber, inhabited by no higher memories than those of a barmaid's paradise of pink ribbons and gentlemen's jokes? She had set out at an early hour, but had lingered on the road, inclined by her indolence to believe that if she waited under a warm shed the snow would cease to fall. She had waited longer than she knew, and now that she found herself belated in the snow-hidden ruggedness of the long lanes, even the animation of a vindictive purpose could not keep her spirit from failing. It was 7 o'clock, and by this time she was not very far from Raveloe, but she was not familiar enough with those monotonous lanes to know how near she was to her journey's end. She needed comfort, and she knew but one comforter, the familiar demon in her bosom. But she hesitated a moment after drawing out the black remnant, before she raised it to her lips. In that moment the mother's love pleaded for painful consciousness rather than oblivion, pleaded to be left in aching weariness rather than to have the encircling arms benumbed so that they could not feel the dear burden. In another moment Molly had flung something away, but it was not the black remnant. It was an empty file, and she walked on again under the breaking cloud, from which there came now and then the light of a quickly veiled star, for a freezing wind had sprung up since the snowing had ceased. But she walked always more and more drowsily, and clutched more and more automatically the sleeping child at her bosom. Slowly the demon was working his will, and cold and weariness were his helpers. Soon she felt nothing but a supreme immediate longing that curtained off all futurity, the longing to lie down and sleep. She had arrived at a spot where her footsteps were no longer checked by a hedgerow, and she had wandered vaguely, unable to distinguish any objects, notwithstanding the wide whiteness around her and the growing starlight. She sank down against the straggling furze bush, an easy pillow enough, and the bed of snow too was soft. She did not feel that the bed was cold, and did not heed whether the child would wake and cry for her. But her arms had not yet relaxed their instinctive clutch, and the little one slumbered on as gently as if it had been rocked in a lace-trimmed cradle. But the complete torpor came at last. The fingers lost their tension, the arms unbent. Then the little head fell away from the bosom, and the blue eyes opened wide on the cold starlight. At first there was a little peevish cry of "Mammy," and an effort to regain the pillowing arm and bosom. But Mammy's ear was deaf, and the pillow seemed to be slipping away backward. Suddenly, as the child rolled downward on its mother's knees, all wet with snow, its eyes were caught by a bright glancing light on the white ground, and, with the ready transition of infancy, it was immediately absorbed in watching the bright living thing running towards it, yet never arriving. That bright living thing must be caught, and in an instant the child had slipped on all fours and held out one little hand to catch the gleam. But the gleam could not be caught in that way, and now the head was held up to see where the cunning gleam came from. It came from a very bright place, and the little one, rising on its legs, toddled through the snow, with the old grimy shawl in which it was wrapped trailing behind it, and the queer little bonnet dangling at its back, toddled on to the open door of Silas Marner's cottage, and right up to the warm hearth, where there was a bright fire of logs and sticks, which had thoroughly warmed the old sack, Silas's greatcoat, spread out on the bricks to dry. The little one, accustomed to be left to itself for long hours without notice from its mother, squatted down on the sack and spread its tiny hands towards the blaze, in perfect contentment, gurgling and making many inarticulate communications to the cheerful fire, like a new-hatched gosling beginning to find itself comfortable. But presently the warmth had a lulling effect, and the little golden head sank down on the old sack, and the blue eyes were veiled by their delicate, half-transparent lids. But where was Silas Marner while this strange visitor had come to his hearth? He was in the cottage, but he did not see the child. During the last few weeks, since he had lost his money, he had contracted the habit of opening his door and looking out from time to time, as if he thought that his money might be somehow coming back to him, or that some trace, some news of it, might be mysteriously on the road and be caught by the listening ear or the straining eye. It was chiefly at night, when he was not occupied in his loom, that he fell into this repetition of an act for which he could have assigned no definite purpose, and which can hardly be understood except by those who have undergone a bewildering separation from a supremely loved object. In the evening twilight, and later, whenever the night was not dark, Silas looked out on that narrow prospect round the stone pits, listening and gazing, not with hope, but with mere yearning and unrest. This morning he had been told by some of his neighbours that it was New Year's Eve, and that he must sit up to hear the old year rung out and the new rung in, because that was good luck, and might bring his money back again. This was only a friendly Raveloe way of jesting with the half-crazy oddities of a miser, but it had perhaps helped to throw Silas into a more than usually excited state. Since the oncoming of twilight he had opened his door again and again, though only to shut it immediately at seeing all distance veiled by the falling snow. But the last time he opened it the snow had ceased, and the clouds were parting here and there. He stood and listened, and gazed for a long while. There was really something on the road coming towards him then, but he caught no sign of it, and the stillness and the wide trackless snow seemed to narrow his solitude, and touched his yearning with a chill of despair. He went in again, and put his right hand on the latch of the door to close it, but he did not close it. He was arrested, as he had been already since his loss, by the invisible wand of catalepsy, and stood like a graven image, with wide but sightless eyes, holding open his door, powerless to resist either the good or the evil that might enter there. When Marner's sensibilities returned, he continued the action which had been arrested, and closed his door, unaware of the chasm in his consciousness, unaware of any intermediate change, except that the light had grown dim, and that he was chilled and faint. He thought he had been too long standing at the door and looking out. Turning towards the hearth, where the two logs had fallen apart and sent forth only a red uncertain glimmer, he seated himself on his fireside chair, and was stooping to push his logs together, when, to his blurred vision, it seemed as if there were gold on the floor in front of the hearth. Gold, his own gold, brought back to him as mysteriously as it had been taken away. He felt his heart begin to beat violently, and for a few moments he was unable to stretch out his hand and grasp the restored treasure. The heap of gold seemed to glow and get larger beneath his agitated gaze. He leaned forward at last and stretched forth his hand, but instead of the hard coin with the familiar resisting outline, his fingers encountered soft warm curls. In utter amazement Silas fell on his knees and bent his head low to examine the marvel. It was a sleeping child, a round fair thing with soft yellow rings all over its head. Could this be the little sister come back to him in a dream? His little sister whom he had carried about in his arms for a year before she died, when he was a small boy without shoes or stockings? That was the first thought that darted across Silas's blank wonderment. Was it a dream? He rose to his feet again, pushed his logs together, and throwing on some dried leaves and sticks, raised a flame. But the flame did not disperse the vision; it only lit up more distinctly the little round form of the child and its shabby clothing. It was very much like his little sister. Silas sank into his chair powerless, under the double presence of an inexplicable surprise and a hurrying influx of memories. How and when had the child come in without his knowledge? He had never been beyond the door. But along with that question, and almost thrusting it away, there was a vision of the old home in the old streets leading to Lantern Yard, and within that vision another of the thoughts which had been present with him in those far-off scenes. The thoughts were strange to him now, like old friendships impossible to revive, and yet he had a dreamy feeling that this child was somehow a message come to him from that far-off life. It stirred fibres that had never been moved in Raveloe, old quiverings of tenderness, old impressions of awe at the presentiment of some power presiding over his life. For his imagination had not yet extricated itself from the sense of mystery in the child's sudden presence, and had formed no conjectures of ordinary natural means by which the event could have been brought about. But there was a cry on the hearth. The child had awaked, and Marner stooped to lift it on his knee. It clung round his neck, and burst louder and louder into that mingling of inarticulate cries with "mammy," by which little children express the bewilderment of waking. Silas pressed it to him, and almost unconsciously uttered sounds of hushing tenderness, while he bethought himself that some of his porridge, which had got cool by the dying fire, would do to feed the child with if it were warmed up a little. He had plenty to do through the next hour. The porridge, sweetened with some dry brown sugar from an old store which he had refrained from using for himself, stopped the cries of the little one, and made her lift her blue eyes with a wide quiet gaze at Silas as he put the spoon into her mouth. Presently she slipped from his knee and began to toddle about, but with a pretty stagger that made Silas jump up and follow her lest she should fall against anything that would hurt her. But she only fell in a sitting posture on the ground, and began to pull at her boots, looking up at him with a crying face as if the boots hurt her. He took her on his knee again, but it was some time before it occurred to Silas's dull bachelor mind that the wet boots were the grievance, pressing on her warm ankles. He got them off with difficulty, and baby was at once happily occupied with the primary mystery of her own toes, inviting Silas, with much chuckling, to consider the mystery too. But the wet boots had at last suggested to Silas that the child had been walking on the snow, and this roused him from his entire oblivion of any ordinary means by which it could have entered or been brought into his house. Under the prompting of this new idea, and without waiting to form conjectures, he raised the child in his arms and went to the door. As soon as he had opened it there was the cry of "Mammy" again, which Silas had not heard since the child's first hungry waking. Bending forward, he could just discern the marks made by the little feet on the virgin snow, and then followed their track to the furze bushes. "Mammy!" the little one cried again and again, stretching itself forward so as almost to escape from Silas's arms, before he himself was aware that there was something more than the bush before him, that there was a human body, with a head sunk low in the furze, and half covered with the shaken snow. Chapter 12